The desert didn't forgive mistakes. Rhett Vale had known that truth his whole life, but he'd never felt it carved quite so deep as he did now, sprawled face down in the sand with blood pooling beneath him and the taste of copper thick on his tongue. His chest burned where the bullets had punched through, one just below the collarbone, the other somewhere near his ribs, and every breath felt like dragging broken glass through his lungs. Above him, the sky stretched endless and blue, indifferent as a hanging judge. He could hear them laughing, not close, maybe 30 yards off, but close enough that the sound reached him through the haze of pain and shock. Voices he recognized, voices he'd trusted, voices that had shared coffee with him at dawn and whiskey at dusk, voices that had promised loyalty when the job was done and the gold was split fair. Liars, every last one of them. "Think he's dead," one of them called out, his tone casual, like he was asking about the weather. "Dead enough," another replied. "2 shots center mass. Ain't nobody walking away from that. Should have put one in his head to be sure. Waste of a bullet. Let the buzzards finish him." More laughter. Then the sound of boots crunching over stone, fading gradually into the distance. Hooves shuffling, leather creaking, the jingle of bridles and the low snort of horses being turned around. They were leaving. Taking the gold. Taking everything. Rhett's vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges like ink spreading across parchment. His fingers twitched in the sand, grasping at nothing. He wanted to curse them, wanted to scream their names and drag them back down into the dirt with him, but his throat wouldn't cooperate. All that came out was a wet, rattling gasp. The desert heat pressed down on him like an iron skillet left too long on the fire. Somewhere overhead, a vulture circled, waiting. "Not yet," he thought. "Not yet, you bastard." But his body wasn't listening. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together until everything was just sand and sky and the terrible crushing weight of knowing he'd been a fool. He'd believed in the wrong men, trusted the wrong promises, and now he'd die for it, alone and forgotten, just another set of bones the desert would swallow whole. The darkness took him. Boom. He woke to the sound of voices again, but these were different, low, cautious, speaking a language he didn't recognize. His eyelids felt like they'd been stitched shut, but he forced them open, squinting against the glare of firelight dancing across canvas walls. A tent. He was inside a tent. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, and beneath that, the sharper scent of something medicinal, bitter herbs crushed into paste. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his chest, white-hot and vicious, dragging a strangled groan from his throat. A hand pressed against his shoulder, firm but not rough, easing him back down onto the bedroll beneath him. Rhett's gaze swiveled to the side, finding a face hovering above him. A man, maybe 40, with copper skin weathered by sun and wind, his black hair pulled back in a single braid. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but there was no hostility in them, just quiet assessment. "Easy," the man said in accented English. "You move too fast, you tear the stitching." Stitching. Rhett's hand drifted toward his chest, fingers brushing over rough bandages wrapped tight around his torso. He could feel the puckered edges of wounds beneath the cloth, still raw and angry. "How long?" Rhett rasped. His voice sounded like gravel scraping over rusted metal. 3 days, the man replied. "You should be dead. Most men would be." "Feels like I am." The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of the man's mouth, gone almost before it appeared. He reached for a water skin lying nearby and held it to Rhett's lips, tipping it just enough for a few careful sips. The water was warm and tasted faintly of leather, but it soothed the raw ache in Rhett's throat. "My brother and I found you in the desert," the man continued, setting the water skin aside. 2 bullet holes, no horse, no supplies. We thought you were already gone, but then you made a sound. Just a breath, really. And we knew you were still fighting." Rhett closed his eyes, the memory of that moment crashing back over him like a wave. The gunshots, the laughter, the sand in his mouth. "Who were they?" the man asked quietly. "The ones who left you to die?" Rhett didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together hard enough to ache. He could still see their faces in his mind's eye, every smirk, every lie, every handshake that had meant nothing. "Men I trusted," he said finally, the words tasting like poison. Men who took something that wasn't theirs. The stranger nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. And now you want it back? It wasn't a question. No, Rhett said, his voice low and edged with something dark. Now I want them to pay for thinking they could take it. The man studied him for a long moment, then rose to his feet with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime moving through wild country. Rest, he said. Your body needs time to heal. When you are strong enough to ride, my brother and I will take you to the nearest town. After that, what you do is your choice. What town? Rhett asked. A place called Tallow Creek. It sits on the border about 2 days south from here. Not much to it, mostly outlaws, drifters, and people who don't ask too many questions. If the men you're looking for were carrying something valuable, that's where they'd go to sell it or hide it. Tallow Creek. The name meant nothing to Rhett, but the description fit well enough. Border towns were always the same, lawless, brutal, and built on the backs of men too desperate or too dangerous to live anywhere else. Why help me? Rhett asked, his gaze sharp despite the exhaustion weighing him down. You don't know me. Don't owe me anything. The man glanced toward the tent's entrance, where another figure sat silhouetted against the firelight outside, his brother presumably keeping watch. When he looked back at Rhett, his expression was calm but resolute. Because leaving a man to die when you can save him is a choice, he said simply. We chose differently. With that, he stepped outside, leaving Rhett alone with the firelight and the quiet crackle of burning wood. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the sand, carrying with it the faint scent of creosote and dust. Rhett lay still, staring up at the canvas ceiling above him. His chest ached, his head throbbed. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry under a merciless sun. But beneath all of that, something else burned, something cold and patient and unforgiving. He wasn't dead. Not yet. And as long as he still had breath in his lungs and strength in his hands, he had a purpose. They thought they'd buried him. They'd laugh about it over whiskey and cards, celebrating the easy score and the fool who'd trusted them. But Rhett Vale wasn't the kind of ghost that stayed quiet. He was the kind that came back. It took 5 more days before Rhett could stand without feeling like his chest was going to split open. The 2 scouts, brothers named Dakota and Nikon, moved their camp slowly southward, keeping to the high ground where the air was cooler and the water easier to find. They didn't ask questions, didn't press him for details. They simply tended to his wounds, shared their food, and waited for him to be ready. Rhett spent most of those days in silence, watching the way they moved through the world, quiet, deliberate, always aware of their surroundings. They spoke little, even to each other, communicating more through glances and gestures than words. It reminded him of the way good soldiers worked together, the kind of trust that didn't need explaining. On the 6th day, Nikon brought him a horse, a sturdy roan gelding with a calm temperament and a steady gait. He's not fast, Nikon said, running a hand along the horse's neck, but he won't quit on you. That matters more out here. Rhett took the reins, testing his grip. His hands were still weak, trembling slightly with the effort, but they held. What do I owe you? He asked. Dakota, who'd been crouched by the fire preparing coffee, glanced up. Nothing, he said. You owe us nothing, but if you ride into Tallow Creek looking for revenge, be careful. That town eats men alive. I've been eaten before, Rhett replied. Didn't take. Dakota's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. Then good luck, he said. You'll need it. They parted ways at dawn the next morning, Rhett heading south on the roan while the brothers turned west toward higher country. He didn't look back. There was no point. The past was done. All that mattered now was what lay ahead. Tallow Creek appeared on the horizon 2 days later, shimmering in the midday heat like a mirage. It wasn't much to look at, a scattered collection of wooden buildings clustered around a dusty main street, flanked on one side by a dried-up creek bed and on the other by low hills dotted with scrub brush. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and even from a distance, Rhett could hear the faint sounds of life. Voices raised in argument, a piano playing badly, the occasional crack of a whip or the bray of a mule. He rode in slowly, keeping his head down and his hat pulled low. The town watched him the way all towns watched strangers, with suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. A few men loitering outside the saloon eyed him as he passed, their gazes lingering on the lean, hard lines of his face and the way he sat his horse, loose but ready. Rhett ignored them. He wasn't here to make friends. The livery stable sat at the far end of town, a sagging structure that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. An old man with a pronounced limp emerged from the shadows as Rhett dismounted, squinting up at him with rheumy eyes. "Need a stall for the night," Rhett said, handing over the reins. The old man grunted, taking the horse without a word. His gaze flicked briefly to Rhett's chest, where the bandages were just visible beneath his shirt, then away again. "2 bits," he said. Rhett paid him and turned to leave, but the old man spoke again, his voice low and rough. "You planning on staying long?" "Depends," Rhett replied, not breaking stride. "On what?" "On whether I find what I'm looking for." The old man made a sound that might have been a chuckle or a cough. "Lot of folks come to Tallow Creek looking for things," he said. "Most of them don't find what they expect." Rhett paused at the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. "What do they find?" "Trouble," the old man said flatly, "and usually more of it than they can handle." Rhett tipped his hat in acknowledgement and stepped out into the street. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dirt beneath his boots to powder. Across the way, the saloon doors swung open, releasing a burst of raucous laughter and the smell of stale beer. A woman leaned against the porch railing, her dress faded and her expression weary. She met Rhett's gaze for a moment, then looked away, uninterested. He moved deeper into the town, his eyes cataloging everything. The false-fronted buildings with their peeling paint, the narrow alleys between them, the places where a man could disappear if he needed to. He noted the marshal's office, a squat brick structure with barred windows and a flag hanging limp in the still air. He noted the general store, the bank, the boarding house with its crooked sign, and he noted the people. The way they moved, the way they talked, the way they looked at each other, or didn't. Tallow Creek was a town built on secrets and silence. Everyone here had something to hide, and no one wanted to be the one caught holding it when the reckoning came. Good, Rhett thought. That would make his job easier. He found a room at the boarding house, a cramped space on the second floor with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the street. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair and a mouth like a knife slash, took his money without asking questions, though her gaze lingered on the worn edges of his boots and the faint bloodstains still visible on his shirt collar. "Bath's extra," she said curtly. "Meals are at 6 and 8. You miss 'em. You go hungry." "Understood," Rhett said. She left without another word, pulling the door shut behind her with a decisive click. Rhett stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the distant murmur of voices from downstairs. Then he crossed to the window, leaning against the frame and staring out at the street below. Somewhere in this town, the men who'd tried to kill him were walking free. Somewhere, the gold they'd stolen was hidden, waiting to be claimed. Somewhere, the truth was buried beneath layers of lies and fear. Rhett intended to dig it all up, every last piece. But first, he needed information. And in a town like this, information came from the places where people gathered to drink, gamble, and talk too much. He left the room and headed for the saloon. The inside of the saloon was dim and smoky, lit by a handful of oil lamps hanging from the ceiling and the faint glow of sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The piano player sat hunched over his instrument in the corner, banging out a tune that was more rhythm than melody. A dozen or so men occupied the tables scattered around the room, some playing cards, others nursing drinks and staring into space with the dull-eyed expression of men who had nowhere else to be. Behind the bar stood a woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pinned up in a loose knot and her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She moved with practiced efficiency, pouring whiskey and wiping down the counter in smooth, automatic motions. Her face was pretty in a hard-edged way, the kind of beauty that had been worn down by too many years of disappointment. Rhett approached the bar and settled onto a stool, resting his forearms on the scarred wood. The woman glanced up, her green eyes flicking over him with the kind of quick, assessing look that came from years of reading people. "What'll it be?" she asked. "Whiskey," Rhett said. "And whatever you know about strangers who came through here recently." Her hand paused mid-pour, just for a fraction of a second, then continued. She set the glass in front of him and leaned back against the shelves behind her, arms crossed. You a lawman? No. Bounty hunter? No. Then why do you care? Rhett took a sip of the whiskey, letting it burn down his throat before answering. Because they took something from me, and I intend to get it back. The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or wariness. This town sees a lot of strangers, she said carefully. Most of them don't stay long, hard to keep track. These ones would have been carrying a lot of money, Rhett said, or gold, probably acting nervous, watching their backs, maybe spending more than they should. The woman was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the room where a group of men sat playing cards. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scarred face and a cigar clenched between his teeth, glanced up as if sensing her attention, his eyes narrowing slightly. She looked away quickly, her jaw tightening. I don't know anything, she said, her voice flat. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Asking questions in Tallow Creek is a good way to end up dead. Rhett studied her for a long moment, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her fingers curled into fists against her arms. She was scared. Not of him. Of something else. Someone else. Who runs this place? He asked quietly. I do, she said, but the way she said it lacked conviction. Who really runs it? Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. If you're smart, you'll finish your drink, get back on your horse, and ride out of here before sundown. Tallow Creek isn't a place for heroes or fools, and I can't tell which one you are yet. I'm neither, Rhett said. I'm just a man settling a debt. Debts get people killed here. So does betrayal. The woman held his gaze for a moment longer, then straightened and turned away, busying herself with wiping down glasses that didn't need cleaning. The conversation was over. Rhett finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft clink. As he stood to leave, the scarred man at the card table called out, his voice carrying across the room. Hey, stranger. Rhett paused, turning slowly. The man was watching him now, his cigar smoke curling lazily upward. The other men at the table had stopped playing, their hands resting near their belts where pistols hung. You new in town? The scarred man asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. Passing through, Rhett said evenly. Funny, you don't look like you're passing through. You look like you're looking for something. Maybe I am. The man grinned, revealing a gap where one of his front teeth used to be. Well, I hope you find it. But a word of advice, keep your eyes on your own business. People who stick their noses where they don't belong tend to lose them. Rhett didn't respond. He simply held the man's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then turned and walked out of the saloon, the sound of low laughter following him into the street. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Rhett stood on the porch for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver, hidden beneath his coat. The town had teeth. He'd felt them brush against him just now, testing, probing, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they bit down. But Rhett Vale had teeth of his own, and he'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with predators was to become something they couldn't afford to ignore. He stepped down into the street and began walking, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Somewhere in this town, the men who'd betrayed him were laughing, drinking, celebrating their good fortune. Let them laugh. Soon enough, they'd learn that some ghosts didn't need graves to rise again. Night fell over Tallow Creek like a shroud, bringing with it a different kind of energy. The saloon grew louder, the piano player more enthusiastic, the voices rougher. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, casting pools of yellow light onto the dirt street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp and insistent. Rhett sat on the edge of his bed in the boarding house, cleaning his revolver by the light of a single candle. The weapon was old but well-maintained, its barrel smooth and its cylinder turning with practiced ease. He loaded it methodically, each bullet sliding into place with a soft click, then set it on the nightstand within easy reach. He didn't expect trouble tonight. Not yet. But in a town like this, expectations meant nothing. A knock at the door broke the silence. Rhett's hand moved to the revolver, his fingers curling around the grip. "It's open," he called out. The door creaked inward, revealing the landlady standing in the hallway with a tray balanced on one hip. "Brought you some supper," she said, her tone brisk. "Figured you might be hungry." Rhett relaxed slightly, nodding toward the small table near the window. "Set it down there." She did so, then hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the revolver on the nightstand. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. "Always," Rhett said. She snorted, a sound halfway between amusement and derision. "Smart man. This town'll chew you up if you let it." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "That woman at the saloon, Mara Keene. She's good people, even if she acts like she isn't. If you're asking questions, be careful who you trust." "Why are you telling me this?" Rhett asked. The landlady shrugged. "Because I'm tired of watching this town eat decent folks alive, and you don't strike me as the type to go down easy." With that, she pulled the door shut behind her, leaving Rhett alone once more. He ate slowly, chewing the tough bread and bland stew without really tasting it. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the pieces of the puzzle he'd started to assemble. The saloon, the scarred man, the woman, Mara Keene, who knew more than she was saying. And somewhere beneath it all, the gold. Waiting. When he finished eating, he set the tray aside and moved back to the window, staring out at the darkened street. A few figures moved through the shadows, drunks stumbling home, a pair of men arguing in low voices, a woman hurrying past with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Tallow Creek was a town that hid its sins in the dark. But darkness, Rhett knew, was where the truth liked to live. He stood there for a long time, watching, waiting, letting the night settle around him like a familiar coat. Tomorrow, he'd start digging. Tomorrow, he'd find the cracks in the town's facade and pry them open until everything inside came spilling out. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. But tonight, he simply stood in the shadows and let the town think it had won. Because the best predators, he'd learned, were the ones nobody saw coming. The morning sun came up hard and unforgiving, turning Tallow Creek into a furnace before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Rhett was already awake, had been for hours, sitting by the window and watching the town come to life. He'd learned long ago that the early hours revealed things, patterns in movement, routines, the subtle hierarchies that governed a place like this. The first person he saw was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, thin as a fence post and dressed in clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. The kid moved down the street with his head down, carrying a bucket that sloshed water with every step. He disappeared into the alley beside the general store, then emerged a few minutes later with the bucket empty, heading back toward the creek bed. Water boy. Every town had one. The kind of kid who did the jobs nobody else wanted for pennies that barely kept him fed. Rhett watched him make 3 more trips before the street began to fill with other people. Merchants opening their shops, women heading to the market, men congregating outside the saloon even though it wouldn't open for another hour. The rhythm of the town was slow, deliberate, like everyone was moving through molasses. But beneath that sluggish surface, Rhett could feel something else. A tension that hummed just below visibility, the kind that came from fear so deeply ingrained it had become part of the landscape. He dressed methodically, strapping on his gun belt and checking the revolver one more time before sliding it into the holster. The weight of it against his hip was familiar, comforting. He pulled on his coat despite the heat, knowing the extra layer would hide the weapon better, then headed downstairs. The boarding house dining room was empty except for the landlady, who was setting out plates of hardtack and beans with the enthusiasm of someone burying a body. She glanced up as Rhett entered, her expression neutral. "Coffee's hot," she said, nodding toward a pot on the sideboard. "Help yourself." Rhett poured a cup and sat down at one of the long tables. The coffee was bitter and strong, the way frontier coffee always was, but it cleared the cobwebs from his mind. He ate in silence, aware of the landlady moving around the room, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "You planning on staying long?" she asked after a while, her back to him as she arranged cups on a shelf. "Depends on how cooperative people are," Rhett replied. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Then you'll be here a while. Cooperation isn't exactly Tallow Creek's strong suit." "Who runs things here?" Rhett asked, keeping his tone casual. Really runs them, I mean, not whoever's got the title. The landlady's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their work. Silas Crow, she said finally, owns the bank, sits on the town council, makes all the pretty speeches about progress and civilization, got a smile that could charm a snake and a handshake that feels like you're sealing a deal with the devil himself. And the other side of the coin? This time she did turn around, her eyes sharp. Lucien Voss runs with a crew of about 15 men, maybe more. They hole up in the old mining camp north of town, come down when they need supplies or entertainment. Voss is the kind of man who enjoys hurting people, not because he has to, because he wants to. Rhett filed the names away. And they share power? More like they divide it. Crow gets the respectable money, banking, land deals, anything that looks legal on paper. Voss gets everything else, protection rackets, stolen goods, the kind of business that happens after dark. They hate each other, but they need each other too. It's a balance. Fragile? As thin ice over deep water. Rhett nodded slowly, turning the information over in his mind. A town split between a hypocrite in a suit and a thug with a gun. Classic setup. The question was where the gold fit into the equation and which side had it, or if neither of them knew it was here at all. He finished his coffee and stood. Appreciate the information. The landlady shrugged. Don't thank me yet. Knowing things in this town is dangerous. Acting on them is usually fatal. Rhett tipped his hat to her and walked out into the morning heat. The street was busier now, people moving with purpose, or at least the appearance of it. Rhett made his way toward the center of town, his gaze sweeping over the buildings and the faces passing by. He was looking for something specific. A tell, a sign, anything that would point him toward the men who'd left him for dead. He found it outside the general store. 2 men stood on the porch, talking in low voices. One of them was the scarred man from the saloon, his cigar replaced by a toothpick, but his expression just as predatory. The other was younger, wiry, with a nervous energy that showed in the way he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. Rhett slowed his pace, angling himself so he could hear their conversation without being obvious about it. Told you, I don't know where he put it, the younger man was saying, his voice tight with frustration. Voss is paranoid. He don't trust nobody. Then you better figure it out, the scarred man replied, his tone flat. Crow's getting impatient, and when he gets impatient, people start disappearing. What's he want with it anyway? Thought we had an arrangement. Arrangements change. You know how it is. The younger man cursed under his breath, kicking at a loose board on the porch. This whole thing's gonna blow up in our faces. I can feel it. Then make sure you're not standing too close when it does. Rhett kept walking, his expression unchanged, but his mind was racing. Voss had something Crow wanted, and whatever it was, it had people scared enough to talk about it in broad daylight, despite the risk. The gold. It had to be. He continued down the street until he reached the bank, a squat brick building with barred windows and a sign that read, Tallow Creek Savings and Loan in freshly painted letters. The door was open, and through it Rhett could see a well-appointed interior, polished wood counters, a safe visible through the doorway to a back room, and a man in a tailored suit standing behind the main desk, speaking to a customer in low, reassuring tones. Silas Crow. Rhett didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, he crossed the street and took up a position outside the dry goods store, leaning against the wall in a way that looked casual, but gave him a clear view of the bank's entrance. Crow was everything the landlady had described. Polished, confident, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a place far more civilized than Tallow Creek. His hair was dark and neatly combed, his suit expensive but not ostentatious, his smile warm and practiced. He shook the customer's hand, clapped him on the shoulder, and sent him on his way with the air of someone who'd just done a great favor. But Rhett had seen men like Crow before, the kind who hid their cruelty behind etiquette and their greed behind charity, the kind who could ruin a man's life with a signature and sleep soundly afterward. As if sensing the scrutiny, Crow's gaze drifted toward the window. For a brief moment, his eyes met Rhett's across the street. There was no recognition there, no alarm, just a flicker of curiosity, quickly masked by another one of those warm smiles. Rhett didn't smile back. He simply held the gaze for a beat, then pushed off the wall and walked away, heading toward the far end of town where the creek bed ran dry and the buildings gave way to open scrubland. He needed to think, needed to plan, and he needed to do it somewhere the town's eyes couldn't follow. The creek bed was a scar carved into the earth, lined with rocks and stunted brush that somehow clung to life despite the relentless heat. Rhett found a spot in the shade of a cottonwood tree and sat down, his back against the trunk, staring out at the empty expanse. The pieces were starting to come together. Voss had the gold, or at least people thought he did. Crow wanted it, and the men who'd betrayed Rhett had probably sold it to Voss or hidden it for him or were working for him in some capacity, which meant Rhett's next move was clear. He needed to get close to Voss. Close enough to confirm the gold was there, close enough to figure out where it was hidden, and close enough to take it back. But getting close to a man like Lucian Voss wasn't something you did by knocking on his door and asking politely. You had to make him come to you. Rhett sat there for a long time, turning over possibilities in his mind, weighing risks against rewards. By the time he stood and brushed the dust from his pants, the sun was high overhead, and the heat was oppressive enough to make the air shimmer. He made his way back toward town, his plan beginning to take shape. It was dangerous, probably stupid, but it was the kind of move that would force people to show their hands, and right now, that was what he needed most. He headed for the saloon. The inside was cooler than the street, but not by much. The same piano player sat at his instrument, hammering out a tune that sounded vaguely like a hymn, but slower and sadder. A handful of men occupied the tables, most of them nursing drinks and looking like they had nowhere better to be. Marikine stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with a rag that had seen better days. She looked up as Rhett entered, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Back again," she said. It wasn't a question. "Seems like the only place in town worth visiting," Rhett replied, settling onto the same stool as the night before. She poured him a whiskey without being asked, setting it down in front of him with a soft clink. "You didn't take my advice." "Which advice was that?" "The part about leaving before you get yourself killed." Rhett took a sip of the whiskey. "I'm harder to kill than I look." "Everyone thinks that," Mara said, leaning against the bar. "Right up until they're wrong." "Maybe, but I've got unfinished business here, the kind that doesn't go away just because I ignore it." Mara studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if looking for something specific. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she sighed and set the rag aside. "What do you want to know?" she asked quietly. "Lucien Voss, where does he keep what's his?" Her jaw tightened. "You're asking the wrong questions." "Then help me ask the right ones." She glanced toward the door, then back at him, her voice dropping even lower. "Voss doesn't keep anything in town. He's got a compound up in the old mining camp, fortified, guarded, impossible to get into unless he invites you. And he doesn't invite strangers." "What about people he does business with?" "He doesn't do business. He takes. If you've got something he wants, he just comes and gets it. And if you try to stop him—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "And Crow?" "Crow's different. He'll smile and shake your hand while he's bleeding you dry, but at least he plays by rules. Voss doesn't even pretend." Rhett nodded slowly. "You said Voss comes to town for supplies and entertainment. When's the last time he was here?" Mara's expression darkened. 3 days ago. Him and his crew tore through here like locusts, drank half the whiskey, broke 2 tables, and put a man in the ground for looking at one of them the wrong way. And no one stopped them. "Who's going to stop them? The marshal?" She laughed, bitter and sharp. "The marshal's on Crow's payroll, and Crow won't move against Voss unless he's got no choice. So we just clean up the mess and hope they don't come back too soon." Rhett finished his whiskey and set the glass down. "I need you to do something for me." Mara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not getting involved in whatever you're planning." "You already are," Rhett said. "The moment you told me about Voss and Crow, you picked a side. Maybe not mine, but you picked one." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, her hands curling into fists on the bar. "What do you want?" "Next time Voss or his men come into town, I need you to send word. Doesn't have to be obvious, just a sign, something I'll recognize." "And then what?" "Then I'll handle it." Mara stared at him for a long moment, her expression conflicted. Finally, she nodded, just once, a sharp jerk of her chin. There's a lamp in the window upstairs. If it's lit during the day, that means they're here. Good enough. She turned away, busying herself with rearranging bottles on the shelf behind her. You're going to get yourself killed, she said without looking at him. And probably me along with you. Maybe, Rhett said, standing, but at least you'll go down swinging. He left the saloon before she could respond, stepping out into the blinding sunlight. The street was quieter now, the midday heat driving most people indoors. Rhett walked slowly, his mind already working through the next steps. He needed leverage, something that would draw Voss out, make him careless. And the best way to do that was to threaten the one thing men like Voss valued above everything else: control. Rhett spent the rest of the afternoon moving through town, watching, listening, picking up fragments of conversation and filing them away. He learned that Voss's crew liked to gamble at a place called the Dusty Rose, a rundown establishment on the edge of town that barely qualified as a building. He learned that Crow held court at the bank every afternoon, dispensing loans and advice with equal generosity, for a price. He learned that the marshal, a heavy-set man named Dalton, spent most of his time drinking and avoiding anything that looked like real work. And he learned about the boy. The water boy he'd seen that morning, the one who moved through town like a ghost, invisible to most people but visible enough to Rhett. The kid's name was Thomas, and according to the whispers Rhett overheard, he was an orphan who'd been passed from family to family until no one wanted him anymore. Now he lived in a shack behind the livery stable, earning just enough to survive by doing odd jobs for anyone who'd pay. Rhett watched the boy haul water until the sun started to set, his thin arms trembling with the effort, but his face set in grim determination. When Thomas finally set the bucket down and collapsed against the wall of the general store, Rhett approached him. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and wary. "I ain't done nothing wrong," he said quickly. "Didn't say you did," Rhett replied, crouching down to the boy's level. "You work hard." Thomas shrugged, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Ain't got much choice." "How much do they pay you?" "Penny a bucket, sometimes two if they're feeling generous." Rhett pulled a silver dollar from his pocket and held it out. "How about you work for me instead?" The boy stared at the coin like it was something from another world. "What do you need?" "Information, eyes and ears. You move through this town better than anyone, and people don't notice you. That makes you valuable." Thomas hesitated, his hand halfway to the coin. "What kind of information?" "The kind that keeps both of us alive. I need to know when Voss and his men come to town, where they go, what they do. And I need to know what people are saying about me." "Why would people be talking about you?" "Because strangers always get talked about, and I'm the kind of stranger who makes people nervous." The boy considered this, his young face far too serious for his age. Finally, he took the coin, gripping it tightly in his fist. "Okay, but if this gets me killed, I'm haunting you." Rhett almost smiled. "Deal." He stood looking down at the boy. "One more thing. If you see anyone following me or asking questions about where I'm staying, you let me know. Understand?" Thomas nodded, already pocketing the coin. "Understand." "Good. Now get some rest. You look like you're about to fall over." The boy muttered something that might have been thanks and shuffled off toward the livery, his shoulders hunched against the evening chill that was starting to creep in. Rhett watched him go, then turned and headed back toward the boarding house. The street was quieter now, the saloons lighting up as the respectable folk retreated indoors and the less respectable ones came out to play. Rhett could hear laughter and shouting from the Dusty Rose, the sound of breaking glass and someone playing a fiddle badly. He climbed the stairs to his room and locked the door behind him, checking the window before settling into the chair by the table. His body ached, the wounds in his chest still raw and tender despite the healing. But his mind was sharp, focused. The pieces were moving. The players were revealing themselves. And soon, very soon, the whole fragile balance the landlady had described would start to crack. Rhett intended to be the one holding the hammer when it did. He sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the town below, and waited for the morning to come. The next 2 days passed slowly, each one dragging like a cart with a broken wheel. Rhett kept to himself mostly, moving through town just enough to be seen but not enough to draw attention. He ate at the boarding house, drank at the saloon, and spent his evening sitting by the window in his room, watching the street below. Thomas proved to be worth every penny. The boy moved through Tallow Creek like smoke, slipping into places adults couldn't go and hearing things they'd never say out loud. He reported back to Rhett each evening, his information sparse but useful. Voss's men had been to the Dusty Rose twice. They'd gambled, drank, and left without causing trouble. Unusual, according to Thomas, who said they normally started fights just for the entertainment. Crow had met with 3 different landowners at the bank, offering loans at terms so favorable it made people suspicious. No one knew what he was planning, but the consensus was it couldn't be good. And people were talking about Rhett, calling him the quiet stranger, the man with dead eyes, the one who looked like he was waiting for something. They weren't wrong. On the 3rd day, Rhett was sitting in the saloon nursing a whiskey when Thomas burst through the doors, his face flushed and his breath coming in gasps. The boy's eyes found Rhett immediately, and he gave a quick, sharp nod toward the window. Rhett's gaze followed the gesture. Upstairs, in the window of Mara's room, a lamp burned bright against the gathering dusk. Voss was here. Rhett stood slowly, leaving coins on the bar, and walked toward the door. Mara caught his eye as he passed, her expression tight with worry, but she said nothing. Outside, the street was alive with tension. A group of horses stood tied to the hitching post outside the Dusty Rose, their saddles dusty and their riders nowhere in sight. But Rhett could hear them. Loud voices, laughter that had an edge of cruelty to it, the kind of sound men made when they knew no one would stop them. He crossed the street and pushed through the doors of the Dusty Rose. The interior was dim and thick with smoke. A dozen men occupied the space, most of them standing around a poker table where a game was in progress. They were rough-looking, all of them, dressed in trail-worn clothes and carrying guns like they were part of their anatomy. And at the center of it all, leaning back in his chair with a cigar between his teeth and a pile of chips in front of him, sat Lucian Voss. He was younger than Rhett had expected, maybe 35, with dark hair slicked back and a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He wore a black vest over a white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars. A revolver hung at his hip, the grip worn smooth from use. The room went quiet when Rhett entered, every eye turning toward him. Voss's gaze flicked up from his cards, assessing Rhett with the same casual interest someone might give a bug crawling across the floor. "Well now," Voss said, his voice smooth and amused. "Don't think I know you." "You don't," Rhett replied, moving further into the room. "Then maybe you're lost. This ain't the kind of place for tourists." "I'm not lost." Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then what are you?" Someone with a question. The men around the table shifted, hands drifting toward their weapons. But Voss held up a hand, stopping them. "I'm feeling generous tonight," he said. "Ask your question, then you can leave." Rhett met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I'm looking for a group of men, 5, maybe 6 of them. Would have come through here about a week ago, carrying something valuable. You seen anyone like that?" The room was silent for a long moment. Then Voss laughed, a low, dangerous sound that made the hair on the back of Rhett's neck stand up. "You've got stones, I'll give you that," Voss said, setting his cards down. "Walking in here and asking me questions like you've got any right to answers. Just want to know if you've seen them. And if I have, then I'd like to know where they are." Voss stood slowly, the chair scraping back across the floor. He was taller than Rhett had thought, broad-shouldered and solid. The men around him tensed, ready. "You know what I think?" Voss said, walking around the table. "I think you're either very brave or very stupid. And I haven't decided which yet." Rhett didn't move. "Does it matter?" "Not really. Either way, you're about to learn an important lesson about how things work in Tallow Creek." Voss moved fast, faster than Rhett expected. His fist came up in a brutal arc, aimed at Rhett's jaw. But Rhett was already moving, twisting to the side and letting the punch sail past him. He drove his elbow into Voss's ribs, hard, then stepped back as the other men surged forward. The fight was short and vicious. Rhett took a blow to the side of his head that made his vision blur, another to his already injured chest that sent white-hot pain lancing through him. But he gave as good as he got, his fists connecting with flesh and bone, his movement sharp and efficient, and then a gun cocked, the sound cutting through the chaos like a knife. Everyone froze. Voss stood a few feet away, his revolver aimed directly at Rhett's chest. Blood trickled from a split lip, and his eyes burned with fury. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Voss said quietly. But before he could pull the trigger, the door burst open and a voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "Put the gun down, Lucien!" Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Silas Crow, flanked by two men in suits who looked like they'd be more comfortable in a boardroom than a saloon brawl. Crow's expression was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes were hard as flint. "This doesn't concern you, Silas," Voss said, not lowering the gun. "It does when you're about to commit murder in the middle of town," Crow replied smoothly. "Bad for business, bad for all of us. This son of a bitch came in here asking questions he had no right to ask. Then throw him out, but shooting him just brings the kind of attention none of us need." Voss's jaw worked, his finger still on the trigger. For a long moment, Rhett thought he'd pull it anyway. Consequences be damned. Then Voss lowered the gun, though the fury in his eyes didn't diminish. "Get out," he said to Rhett, his voice low and dangerous. "And if I see you again, there won't be anyone here to save you." Rhett straightened, wiping blood from his mouth. He looked at Voss, then at Crow, memorizing both faces. Then he walked out, his body screaming in protest, but his mind clear and sharp. Outside, the night air was cool and welcome. Rhett leaned against the wall of the building, breathing hard, his chest throbbing where the old wounds had been reopened. He'd gotten what he came for, confirmation that Voss knew something, confirmation that Crow was watching, and most importantly, confirmation that the two of them were on a collision course. All Rhett had to do now was make sure he was standing in the right place when they crashed. Rhett made it back to the boarding house before his legs gave out. The landlady took one look at him and didn't ask questions, just brought him a basin of water and clean rags, then left him alone. He stripped off his shirt in the dim light of the oil lamp and examined the damage in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The wounds in his chest had reopened, not badly, but enough that blood seeped through the bandages and dark patches. His ribs screamed with every breath, and a bruise was already forming along his jaw where one of Voss's men had connected. But he was alive, and more importantly, he'd gotten what he needed. He cleaned the wounds as best he could, rewrapped them with strips torn from an old shirt, and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the raw ache of a body that had been pushed too far too fast. A soft knock at the door made him reach for his gun. "It's me," came Thomas's voice, muffled through the wood. Rhett opened the door. The boy slipped inside, his eyes going wide when he saw the blood on the rags in the basin. "You're hurt bad," Thomas said. "I've had worse." "That don't make it better." The boy shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Whole town's talking about what happened at the Dusty Rose. They're saying you're either crazy or got a death wish." "Maybe both," Rhett said, easing himself back onto the bed. "What else are they saying?" "That Voss is going to kill you, that Crow saved your life for reasons nobody understands, that you must be looking for something real important to be that stupid." Rhett almost smiled. "They're not wrong." Thomas hesitated, then moved closer, his young face serious. "Mister, I don't know what you're after, but Voss ain't the kind of man you cross and live to tell about it. He's killed people for less than what you did tonight." "I'm counting on him trying," Rhett said quietly. The boy's brow furrowed. "You want him to come after you?" "I want him angry. Angry men make mistakes, and when he makes his, I'll be ready." Thomas digested this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. "There's something else," he said after a moment. "I heard some of Voss's men talking outside the Dusty Rose after you left. They were mad, real mad, and one of them said something about moving the stash before someone else gets ideas." Rhett's attention sharpened. "Moving it where?" "Didn't say. But they mentioned the old graveyard on the north edge of town, said something about checking the markers." The graveyard. Rhett filed that away, his mind already working through possibilities. If Voss was paranoid enough to move the gold, it meant he was worried. And if he was worried, it meant he thought someone else knew where it was. Someone like Silas Crow. "Good work," Rhett said, pulling another silver dollar from his pocket and tossing it to the boy. Keep your ears open. Anything else you hear, especially about Crow or Voss, you bring it to me. Thomas caught the coin and nodded. You gonna be okay? I'll manage. The boy lingered for a moment longer as if wanting to say something else, then turned and slipped out the door as quietly as he'd come. Rhett locked it behind him and returned to the bed, lying back carefully and staring up at the ceiling. The graveyard. It made a certain kind of sense. Nobody went to graveyards unless they had to, and in a town like Tallow Creek, the dead were buried and forgotten quickly. It would be the perfect place to hide something valuable, at least temporarily. But if Voss was moving the gold, it meant the situation was more volatile than Rhett had thought. The balance between Voss and Crow was already fracturing, and Rhett's presence had accelerated the process, which was exactly what he wanted. He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him under despite the pain. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new dangers, but for now, he needed rest. The ghosts could wait until morning. When Rhett woke, the sun was already high, and the boarding house was quiet. He dressed slowly, every movement a reminder of the previous night's violence, and made his way downstairs. The landlady was in the kitchen, and she looked up as he entered. There's a man waiting for you, she said, her tone carefully neutral. In the parlor. Been there about an hour. Rhett's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. What kind of man? The well-dressed kind. Said his name was Crow. Of course it was. Rhett found Silas Crow sitting in one of the parlor's worn chairs, looking completely out of place among the faded wallpaper and threadbare furniture. He wore a different suit today, charcoal gray with a burgundy vest, and his shoes were polished to a shine that seemed almost obscene in a town built on dust. Crow stood when Rhett entered, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Vale, I presume? So he'd been asking questions. You presume correctly. May I? Crow gestured to the chairs. It's not my parlor, Rhett said, but he sat down anyway, positioning himself so he had a clear view of both the door and the window. Crow settled back into his seat with the ease of a man accustomed to being comfortable everywhere. I wanted to thank you, he said. For what? For being exactly the kind of catalyst this town needed. Crow pulled out a silver cigarette case, offered one to Rhett, who declined, then lit one for himself. The smoke curled upward in lazy spirals. Tallow Creek has been stuck in a rather unpleasant equilibrium for quite some time. Your arrival has disrupted that. I find it refreshing. I'm not here to refresh anything, Rhett said flatly. I'm here for what's mine. Ah, yes. The gold. Crow's smile widened slightly. You're not particularly subtle, Mr. Vale. Walking into Voss's den and asking about it? That takes either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity. You already said that last night. Did I? Well, it bears repeating. Crow tapped ash into a small tray on the side table. Here's what I know. About a week ago, 5 men rode into town looking nervous and flush with money. They met with Voss, there was some kind of transaction, and then 3 of them left. The other 2 stayed, working as part of Voss's crew. Rhett's jaw tightened. Names? The ones who stayed? Cole Hendricks and Dutch Farrow? Nasty pieces of work, both of them. The ones who left, I couldn't say. They didn't linger long enough for anyone to learn much about them. Cole and Dutch. Rhett remembered them both. Cole was the one with the scar across his knuckles, always quick with a knife. Dutch was the talker, the one who could charm his way out of most situations. Neither of them had struck Rhett as particularly trustworthy, but he'd needed bodies for the job and they'd come recommended. Where are they now? Rhett asked. Voss's compound, most likely. Usted. He's been keeping his men close since last night. I imagine he's rather upset about your little confrontation. Good. Crow studied him through the cigarette smoke, his expression thoughtful. You're planning something that's going to turn this town upside down. Maybe. I want to help. Rhett laughed, a short, harsh sound. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're a man with nothing to lose, which makes you dangerous. I know you want revenge on the men who betrayed you, which makes you motivated. And I know that whatever you're planning will hurt Lucius and Voss, which makes you useful to me. You want Voss gone, Rhett said. It wasn't a question. I want Voss's assets, Crow corrected. The gold he's sitting on, the territory he controls, the fear he generates. With him out of the picture, all of that becomes available. And I'm a man who appreciates opportunity. Rhett stood, looking down at Crow with undisguised contempt. I'm not interested in being your weapon. Not my weapon, Crow said smoothly, also rising. My partner. Help me bring down Voss, and I'll make sure you get what you came for. The gold, revenge on the men who left you for dead, whatever you need. All I ask is that when the dust settles, you walk away and let me handle the aftermath. And if I say no? Crow's smile faded, replaced by something colder. Then I'll make sure Voss knows exactly who you are and what you're after, and you'll be dead before sunset. The threat hung in the air between them, naked and unambiguous. Rhett held Crow's gaze, reading the calculation there, the absolute certainty that he held the better hand. I'll think about it, Rhett said finally. Don't think too long. Events have a way of moving quickly in Tallow Creek, especially once blood is in the water. Crow moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Oh, and Mr. Vele? That business at the graveyard Voss is planning? I'd stay away from there if I were you. Men who go digging in graveyards tend to end up in them. He left before Rhett could respond, the door closing softly behind him. Rhett stood alone in the parlor, his mind racing. Crow knew about the graveyard, which meant he had someone inside Voss's organization feeding him information. It also meant that whatever was happening there was important enough that Crow wanted Rhett away from it, which was exactly why Rhett needed to be there. He left the boarding house and found Thomas sweeping the steps of the general store. The boy looked up as Rhett approached, his expression wary. Need another favor, Rhett said quietly. What kind? The dangerous kind. I need you to go to Mara at the saloon and give her a message. Tell her I need to know when Voss's men head to the graveyard. Tell her it's important. Thomas swallowed hard. What if they catch me asking questions? Then you tell them you're running errands for Miss Keene and you don't know nothing about nothing. Can you do that? The boy nodded, though fear flickered in his eyes. Rhett pressed another coin into his palm, this one a gold piece that made Thomas's eyes go wide. You keep that no matter what happens, Rhett said. And if things go bad, you take that money and you run. You understand? You don't try to be brave, you just run. Yes, sir, Thomas whispered. Good. Now go. The boy took off at a run, disappearing around the corner. Rhett watched him go, a cold weight settling in his chest. He was putting the kid in danger, no question about it. But he needed eyes and ears, and Thomas was willing. Besides, everyone in Tallow Creek was already in danger. They just didn't know it yet. Rhett spent the rest of the day preparing. He cleaned his gun, checked his ammunition, and sharpened the knife he kept in his boot. He ate a meal he didn't taste and drank coffee that sat like lead in his stomach. And he waited. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when Thomas came running back, his face flushed and his breath coming in gasps. They're moving, he panted. Miss Keene said 6 men just rode out, heading north. She thinks they're going to the graveyard. Did anyone see you talking to her? No, sir. She pulled me into the back room like she was going to give me a job, then told me quick and sent me out the front. Smart woman. Good work. Now you go back to the livery and you stay there. Don't come out until morning. You hear me? Thomas nodded and ran off again. Rhett checked his gun one more time, then headed for the livery himself. He needed a horse, and he needed to move fast. The old liveryman was mucking out a stall when Rhett arrived. He looked up, his expression sour. Thought you might be coming around. Heard about the trouble last night. I need my horse, Rhett said. Now. You ain't gonna find nothing but more trouble riding out at this hour. That's my problem. The old man shrugged and fetched the roan, saddling it with practiced efficiency. As Rhett mounted, the liveryman spoke again, his voice low. Whatever you're planning, I hope it works. This town could use someone willing to stand up to the likes of Voss. Rhett didn't respond. He spurred the horse into motion, heading north through the gathering dusk. The graveyard sat on a low rise about a mile outside of town, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that had long since fallen into disrepair. Crooked headstones jutted from the hard-packed earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions worn smooth by wind and time. A few gnarled trees provided sparse shade, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Rhett approached from the east, keeping to the shadows and moving slowly. He could see the glow of lanterns up ahead, hear the low murmur of voices and the sound of shovels biting into dirt. He dismounted and tied the roan to a tree well out of sight, then crept closer on foot. 6 men, just as Thomas had said. They were scattered throughout the graveyard, some digging, others standing watch. Rhett recognized a few faces from the dusty rows, including the scarred man who'd been talking to his companion outside the general store. But it was the figure standing at the center of it all that held Rhett's attention. Lucien Voss himself, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands on his hips, watching his men work with the cold focus of a predator. He barked orders occasionally, his voice sharp and impatient. "Dig faster," he snapped at one man who was moving too slowly. "It's got to be here somewhere." "We've checked every marker like you said," the man replied, frustration evident in his tone. "There's nothing." "Then check again." "Crow's got someone feeding him information, which means he knows more than he should. I want that gold moved before he makes his move." So Voss was worried about Crow. And he was looking for the gold in the graveyard, which meant it was already here, hidden somewhere among the graves. Rhett watched from the darkness, his mind working. This was an opportunity, but it was also a trap. If he made a move now, he'd be outnumbered 6-1, possibly more if Voss had backup waiting nearby. But if he waited, if he let Voss find the gold and move it, he might lose his only chance. And then he saw something that changed everything. One of the men digging near the far edge of the graveyard let out a shout. "Found something!" Everyone converged on the spot. The man knelt down, brushing dirt away from what looked like a metal box buried beneath a headstone. Voss pushed through the group, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Pull it out," he ordered. 2 men grabbed the edges of the box and hauled it up, grunting with the effort. It was heavy, maybe 3 feet long and a foot deep, with a rusted lock holding it shut. Voss grabbed a shovel and smashed the lock off with one brutal swing, then threw open the lid. Even from a distance, Rhett could see the glint of gold in the lantern light. His gold. The gold he'd bled for, killed for, nearly died for. The gold those bastards had stolen after putting 2 bullets in his chest. Something cold and vicious unfurled in Rhett's chest, a rage so pure it felt almost like calm. Voss was saying something to his men, gesturing toward the box, but Rhett wasn't listening anymore. He was moving, his hand sliding to his gun, his body coiling like a spring ready to snap. And then a voice spoke from the darkness behind him, low and amused. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Rhett spun, his gun half drawn, and found himself staring at Silas Crow. The banker stood there in the shadows, flanked by 4 men with rifles pointed directly at Rhett. "Lower the weapon," Crow said pleasantly, "or my men will lower you." Rhett's jaw clenched, but he holstered the gun slowly. "You followed me." "Of course I did. You're predictable, Mr. Vale. I knew you'd come here tonight, knew you'd try to take the gold yourself, and I couldn't allow that." "Why not just let Voss kill me?" "Because you're more useful alive. For now." Crow stepped closer, his expression calculating. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay right here, quiet as a mouse, while Voss loads up that gold and takes it back to his compound. Then, when the time is right, you and I are going to pay him a visit." "You think I'm just going to stand here and watch him take what's mine?" "I think you don't have a choice." Crow's smile was razor sharp. "My men will shoot you if you move. Voss's men will shoot you if you reveal yourself. Either way, you're dead. So be smart, Mr. Vale. Be patient. Your revenge will come. Just not tonight." Rhett stood there, fury boiling in his veins, his hands clenching into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to draw his gun and go down swinging if that's what it took. But Crow was right. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and out of options. For now. So he stood there in the darkness and watched as Voss and his men loaded the gold onto a wagon, covered it with canvas, and rode out of the graveyard like thieves in the night. He watched the lanterns fade into the distance, taking with them the last remnants of the life he'd known before the betrayal. When they were gone, Crow lowered his rifle and smiled. "See? That wasn't so hard." "When this is over," Rhett said quietly, "you and I are going to have a reckoning." "Perhaps," Crow replied unperturbed. "But first we have to deal with Voss. And for that, I need you angry. I need you focused. And most importantly, I need you willing to do what I can't do myself. Which is, get your hands dirty. Crow turned to leave, his men following. Go back to town, Mr. Vale. Rest. Tomorrow, things are going to get very interesting. Rhett stood alone in the graveyard, surrounded by the dead and the echoes of men who'd already forgotten what honor meant. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. He'd come to Tallow Creek for revenge, for justice, for the gold that had cost him everything. But now, standing among the graves with betrayal stacked on top of betrayal, Rhett realized something fundamental had changed. This wasn't about the gold anymore. This was about burning down the whole rotten structure and making sure everyone who'd built it suffered for what they'd created. Crow thought he could control this, thought he could use Rhett like a weapon and discard him when the job was done. He was wrong. Rhett walked back to his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. The night air was cold now, cutting through his shirt and making his wounds ache. But he barely felt it. He mounted the roan and rode back toward town, his mind already working through the pieces, rearranging them into something new, something Crow wouldn't expect. By the time the lights of Tallow Creek appeared on the horizon, Rhett had a plan. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, and it would require perfect timing, but it would work. And when it was done, neither Voss nor Crow would be left standing. He returned the horse to the livery and made his way back to the boarding house. The landlady was still awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "You look like a man who just saw something he can't unsee," she said. "Something like that. Is it going to bring more trouble to this town?" Rhett paused in the doorway. "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." "So do I," Rhett said, and climbed the stairs to his room. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, watching the street below and waiting for the sun to rise. His body ached, his chest throbbed where the wounds had reopened, and exhaustion pulled at him like an anchor. But his mind was clear. Tomorrow, he would visit Mara. He would tell her what he needed her to do, and then he would put the final pieces into motion. Crow wanted to use him as a weapon against Voss. Fine. Rhett would be that weapon. But when the smoke cleared and the bodies fell, Crow would learn that some weapons couldn't be sheathed once they'd tasted blood. The sun came up slowly, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Rhett watched it rise, his expression hard and unforgiving. Tallow Creek had built itself on fear and lies, and the bones of people too weak to fight back. It was time to show them what happened when someone refused to stay buried. The saloon was quiet when Rhett pushed through the doors just after dawn. The piano sat silent in the corner, and the tables were empty except for one drunk sleeping with his head on his folded arms. The air still smelled of stale whiskey and tobacco from the night before, and the floor was sticky under Rhett's boots. Mara stood behind the bar, counting bottles with a ledger open in front of her. She looked up when she heard him enter, her green eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. "You look like hell," she said. "Feel like it, too." Rhett crossed to the bar and sat down heavily. "Need to talk." She glanced toward the drunk in the corner, then set down her pencil and moved closer, keeping her voice low. "Word is you were at the graveyard last night. Word is Voss found what he was looking for and moved it to his compound. Word travels fast. In this town, it's the only thing that moves fast." She studied his face, taking in the bruises, the exhaustion, the cold determination in his eyes. "You're planning something that's going to get people killed." "Already got people killed," Rhett said quietly. "Question is whether the right ones die this time." Mara's jaw tightened. She poured herself a whiskey despite the early hour and downed it in one swallow. "What do you need from me?" "Information, and a favor that might get you hurt." "I'm already hurt just by being in this conversation. Might as well hear the rest." Rhett leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Voss has the gold at his compound. Crow wants it. They're going to tear each other apart trying to get it, and this whole town is going to burn in the process, unless someone gives them a reason to do it on terms that leave them both exposed. And you're that someone. I'm the match. But I need kindling." He held her gaze. "I need you to spread a rumor. Quietly, carefully, like it's something you heard by accident. Tell people that Crow's planning to move against Voss tonight, that he's got men coming in from out of town, that he's going to take the compound by force. Mara's eyes widened. That's suicide. If Voss hears that, he'll fortify the compound and kill anyone who comes near it. That's the idea. She stared at him for a long moment, comprehension dawning slowly. You want them both there. You want them trapped together. I want them so busy watching each other, they don't see me coming. And then what? You walk in and take the gold while they're killing each other? Something like that. Mara shook her head, but there was a grim admiration in her expression. You're either brilliant or insane. Probably both. Rhett stood, wincing as his ribs protested. Can you do it? She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the bar. Then she nodded once. I'll spread the word. But Rhett, if this goes wrong, if Voss comes for me because of this, he won't get the chance, Rhett said. One way or another, this ends tonight. He left before she could respond, stepping out into the harsh morning light. The street was starting to wake up, people emerging from buildings with the slow reluctance of those who knew the day held nothing good. Rhett walked toward the boarding house, his mind already moving to the next piece of the plan. He found Thomas sitting on the steps of the general store, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked too big for his hands. The boy looked up as Rhett approached, his expression wary. Thought you told me to stay at the livery, Thomas said. That was last night. This is now. Rhett sat down beside him, keeping his voice casual. I need you to do something for me. Something important. More important than last time? More dangerous too. Thomas set down his knife, his young face serious. What is it? I need you to get a message to Silas Crow. Tell him you overheard some of Voss's men talking, that Voss knows about the plan to raid his compound, that he's setting a trap. Tell him Voss is expecting Crow tonight, and he's ready. The boy's eyes went wide. But that ain't true, is it? You're making it up. I'm making both sides think the other knows something they don't. It'll force them to move faster, make mistakes. And if they catch me lying, Rhett pulled out the last of his gold coins, pressing them into Thomas's palm. Then you take this money and you run as far and as fast as you can. You don't look back, you don't try to help, you just survive. Understand? Thomas stared at the coins, his throat working. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for gold? It's not about the gold anymore, Rhett said quietly. It's about making sure men like Voss and Crow don't get to keep building their kingdoms on other people's graves. The boy was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded and pocketed the coins. I'll deliver the message. Be careful. And Thomas? Rhett met his eyes. After you give Crow the message, you get yourself somewhere safe. The livery, the church, somewhere with thick walls and a locked door. And you stay there until morning, no matter what you hear. What am I going to hear? Nothing good. Thomas swallowed hard but nodded again. He stood, tucked the knife into his belt, and walked off with the determined stride of someone trying very hard not to show fear. Rhett watched him go, a weight settling in his chest. The kid deserved better than this. Deserved better than a town that ground people down until there was nothing left but survival. But after tonight, maybe things would be different, or maybe they'd just be over. Rhett spent the rest of the day preparing. He went back to his room and checked his weapons, cleaned his gun again even though it didn't need it, sharpened his knife until the blade could split a hair. He ate a meal he didn't taste, drank water until his canteen was empty, and tried to rest even though sleep wouldn't come. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, multiple sets. He was on his feet with his hand on his gun before the knock came. Mr. Vale, Crow's voice smooth and controlled, I think we need to have a conversation. Rhett opened the door. Crow stood there with 3 men behind him, all armed, all watching Rhett with the cold focus of professionals. Crow himself looked immaculate as always, his suit pressed and his hair perfectly combed, but there was something different in his eyes. Something harder. I've been hearing interesting rumors, Crow said, stepping into the room uninvited. His men stayed in the hallway. Rumors about me planning a raid on Voss's compound, Curious, isn't it? Since I haven't told anyone about such a plan. Rumors start easy in a town like this, Rhett said evenly. They do. But these ones are very specific, very detailed, almost like someone planted them deliberately. Crow's gaze was sharp, assessing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Why would I spread rumors that benefit you? That's exactly what I've been asking myself. Crow walked to the window, looking out at the street below. And then I realized they don't benefit me, they benefit you. You're trying to force my hand, make me move before I'm ready. The question is why? Rhett said nothing. Crow turned back to face him. Here's what I think. I think you're planning to make a move on Voss tonight, with or without me. I think you've been playing both of us against each other, spreading lies to create chaos so you can slip in and take what you want while we're distracted. Smart man, Rhett said. Smart enough to know when someone's trying to manipulate me. Crow's expression hardened. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me, right now, and we're going to pay Mr. Voss a visit together. And if I refuse, then my men will shoot you where you stand and I'll deal with Voss myself. It'll be messier, more costly, but I'll manage. Crow pulled out his pocket watch, checked the time, then snapped it shut. Your choice, Mr. Vale. Partner or corpse. Rhett looked at the three men in the hallway, their hands resting on their guns, their expressions blank and professional. He could try to fight, could maybe take one or two of them down before they killed him. But then he'd die here, in this small room, without ever seeing the men who'd betrayed him face justice. That wasn't acceptable. Fine, he said. I'll come. Excellent. Crow smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, and leave the gun. My men will feel more comfortable that way. Rhett unbuckled his gun belt slowly and set it on the bed. The knife in his boot stayed where it was, hidden beneath his pant leg. If Crow's men noticed, they didn't comment. They left the boarding house in a tight group, Crow walking beside Rhett, while the three armed men formed a triangle around them. The street was emptying as people headed indoors for the evening, and the few who saw them pass quickly looked away, not wanting to be associated with whatever was happening. A wagon waited at the end of the street, its bed empty except for a few coils of rope and a canvas tarp. Two more men sat on the driver's bench, both armed with rifles. Crow gestured for Rhett to climb into the back. Comfortable? Crow asked, settling onto the bench beside the driver. Not particularly. Good. Comfort breeds complacency. Crow signaled to the driver, and the wagon lurched into motion, heading north out of town. The ride took almost an hour, following a rough track that wound through scrubland and low hills. The sun sank lower, the shadows lengthening until everything was painted in shades of red and gold. Rhett sat in the back of the wagon, watching the landscape roll by, his mind working through contingencies and backup plans. Crow had called his bluff, or at least part of it, but that didn't mean the plan was ruined, it just meant Rhett had to adapt. The compound appeared as they crested a rise, sprawling across a small valley like a predator at rest. It had been a mining camp once, back when men still believed there was gold in these hills. Now it was a fortress, with wooden walls topped with sharpened stakes, guard towers at each corner, and a heavy gate reinforced with iron bars. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Rhett could see figures moving on the walls, silhouetted against the dying light. Voss had built himself a kingdom here. A small one, but a kingdom nonetheless. The wagon rolled to a stop about 50 yards from the gate. Crow stood, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Lucien Voss," he called out. "I'd like to have a conversation." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure appeared on the wall above the gate, backlit by torches so his features were hidden in shadow. "Silas Crow," Voss's voice carried easily across the distance, amused and dangerous. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I have something you want," Crow called back. "And I believe you have something I want. I propose a trade." "What makes you think I'm interested in trading?" "Because I brought you a gift." Crow gestured toward the wagon. "Rhett Vale. The man who's been causing you so much trouble. He's all yours if you're willing to negotiate." Rhett's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. This was Crow's play, and he needed to see where it led. There was a pause, then Voss laughed, the sound echoing across the valley. "You brought him to me? How thoughtful. But I have to ask, why would you give me something for free when you could try to use him against me? Because he's more trouble than he's worth, Crow replied, and because I'd rather do business with you than waste resources fighting over a man who's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. Flattering, Voss's tone was dry. And what do you want in return? A percentage. 20% of the gold you recovered from the graveyard. Consider it a finder's fee for bringing you the man who's been sniffing around it. Another pause. Rhett could almost hear the gears turning in Voss's head, weighing the offer, looking for the trap. 15%, Voss said finally, and you leave town. I don't want to see your face in Tallow Creek again. Done. Crow's smile was sharp. Send someone out to collect your gift. The gate creaked open and 6 men emerged, all armed, all moving with the careful precision of soldiers. They surrounded the wagon, their guns trained on Rhett. One of them, a tall man with a scarred face that Rhett recognized from the dusty rows, climbed into the wagon bed and yanked Rhett to his feet. Nice to see you again, the man said, his breath reeking of whiskey. Voss is going to enjoy this. They dragged Rhett out of the wagon and marched him toward the gate. Behind him, he heard Crow's voice, cheerful and satisfied. Pleasure doing business with you, Lucian. The gate closed behind them with a boom that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. Inside the compound, the world narrowed to torch-lit shadows and the smell of smoke and sweat. The men shoved Rhett forward, their hands rough and their laughter cruel. Buildings lined the interior walls. Barracks, a cookhouse, what looked like an armory. In the center stood a larger structure, 2 stories tall, with light spilling from its windows. They pushed him through the door into a room that had probably been an office once, but now served as Voss's throne room. The furniture was mismatched and expensive-looking, clearly stolen from a dozen different sources. Maps covered one wall, marked with territories and routes. A table in the corner held bottles of whiskey and a deck of cards. And in the center of it all, sitting in a leather chair with his feet propped on a desk, sat Lucien Voss. He looked up as Rhett was shoved inside, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Well, well, the ghost who wouldn't stay buried. I have to admit, Vale, you've got persistence. Stupidity, too, but mostly persistence. Rhett said nothing, his gaze sweeping the room, cataloging exits and weapons. There were 4 men besides Voss, all armed, all watching him with the anticipation of predators about to be fed. Voss stood, walking around the desk with slow, deliberate steps. You cost me sleep, you know that? Walking into my town, asking questions, picking fights. I started wondering who you were, what you wanted, and then I figured it out. He stopped a few feet from Rhett, his smile cold. You're one of the idiots who tried to steal that gold in the first place. One of the ones who got left behind. Not left behind, Rhett said quietly. Left for dead, there's a difference. Not much of one. Voss circled him slowly like a shark. Let me guess. Your partners shot you, took the gold, and sold it to me. And now you're here for revenge. Very dramatic. Very stupid. Where are they? Who? Cole and Dutch? Voss laughed. They're around, probably getting drunk or breaking someone's face. Why? You want to have a reunion? Something like that. Voss stopped circling, his expression turning thoughtful. You know what? I think I'll arrange that. But first, I want to know something. What made you think you could walk into my compound and walk out alive? Who said anything about walking out? The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Voss's expression darkened, understanding dawning. You're not here for the gold. You're here to burn it all down. Finally, Rhett said, someone who gets it. Voss's fist came up fast, catching Rhett across the jaw with enough force to snap his head sideways. Pain exploded through his skull, and he tasted blood. Before he could recover, 2 of Voss's men grabbed his arms, holding him upright. Tie him up, Voss ordered, his voice cold. I want Cole and Dutch here to see this. They should get to watch the man they betrayed die slowly. They dragged Rhett to a chair and bound his wrists and ankles with rope, pulling it tight enough to cut off circulation. One of the men left, presumably to fetch Cole and Dutch. The others stood back, watching, their expressions eager. Voss poured himself a whiskey and sat back down, studying Rhett like an interesting specimen. You almost pulled it off, you know, coming to town, stirring up trouble between me and Crow. If you'd been smarter about it, you might have gotten us both killed and taken the gold for yourself." "Night's not over yet," Rhett said. "For you it is." Voss sipped his whiskey. "But I'll give you this. You've got courage. Most men would be begging by now. Most men haven't had to claw their way out of their own grave." The door opened and 3 men entered. Rhett recognized 2 of them immediately, Cole Hendricks with his scarred knuckles and cold eyes, and Dutch Pharaoh with his easy smile that had always hidden a vicious streak. The 3rd man was a stranger, tall and lean with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Cole stopped dead when he saw Rhett, his face going pale. "Jesus Christ." "Not quite," Rhett said, "but close." Dutch's smile faltered, then returned, wider and more forced. "Rhett, hell of a surprise. Thought you were dead." "You thought right. Just didn't stay that way." Cole found his voice, though it came out strained. "Voss, this is the man we told you about. The one we had to leave behind when the job went bad." "I figured as much." Voss gestured with his glass. "He's been making quite a nuisance of himself. Thought you might want to watch him die." "We don't want any part of this," Dutch said quickly, backing toward the door. "That's between you and him." "I disagree." Voss's voice hardened. "You brought him into my business. That makes it your problem too." He nodded to one of his men, who moved to block the exit. "Besides, he might have some interesting things to say before he dies. Things about loyalty, trust, partnership. The kind of things that make me wonder if you 2 are the type of men I want working for me." Cole's hand moved toward his gun. A reflexive motion quickly aborted when he saw 3 rifles aimed at his chest. "We've been loyal to you," he said, his voice tight. "Done everything you asked. Except kill the one man who could connect you to that gold heist." Voss stood, setting down his glass. "See, here's the thing. I don't like loose ends, and I especially don't like loose ends that walk into my compound looking for revenge." The room went very quiet. Rhett could feel the tension building, that moment right before violence when everything hung in perfect, terrible balance. And then the explosion hit. The blast came from somewhere outside, a deep boom that shook the building and sent dust raining from the ceiling. Men shouted, guns fired, and through the window Rhett could see flames leaping into the night sky. Voss spun toward the window. "What the hell?" A second explosion, closer this time, followed by the sound of splintering wood and screaming. The door burst open and a man stumbled in, his face blackened with soot. "We're under attack. Crow's men are everywhere." "How many?" Voss demanded. "Dozens. They're burning everything." Voss cursed and grabbed his gun belt from the desk. His men were already moving, some toward the door, others toward the windows. In the chaos, no one was watching Rhett, which was exactly what he'd been counting on. He'd worked the ropes loose during his conversation with Voss, the knife from his boot now pressed against the cords binding his wrists. The blade was sharp, the rope frayed, and with one final sawing motion it parted. He freed his ankles in seconds, then lunged across the room toward Cole. The man saw him coming and tried to draw, but Rhett was faster. He slammed into Cole with his full weight, driving them both to the floor. His fist connected with Cole's face once, twice. Then he had the man's gun and was rolling away as Dutch opened fire. The bullet went wide, punching through the wall behind where Rhett had been. Rhett came up firing, his stolen gun barking 3 times. Dutch went down with a scream, blood spreading across his shirt. Cole was scrambling for another weapon when Rhett put a bullet in his leg. The man collapsed, howling, his hands clutching at the wound. Voss turned from the window, his gun coming up, but Rhett was already moving. He dove behind the desk as Voss fired, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. Then he was up and running, crashing through the door into the chaos outside. The compound was burning. Flames engulfed 2 of the barracks, and smoke filled the air thick enough to choke on. Men ran in every direction, some fighting, some fleeing, all of them panicked. Gunfire crackled like fireworks, and somewhere in the distance someone was screaming for water. Rhett ran toward the armory, bullets kicking up dirt around his feet. He didn't know if it was Voss's men shooting at him or Crow's, and he didn't care. All that mattered was reaching the gold before everything went to hell completely. The armory door was locked, but a bullet through the mechanism fixed that. Inside, crates and barrels lined the walls, along with racks of rifles and ammunition. And in the back, sitting on a reinforced table, was the metal box from the graveyard. His gold. Rhett grabbed the box, grunting at the weight, and turned to leave. A shadow filled the doorway, and he found himself facing Lucien Voss, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead and murder in his eyes. "You," Voss said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is all you. You set this up." "Figured it out, did you? Crow didn't come here to trade. He came here to destroy me. And you let him use you as bait." Voss raised his gun. "But you're not walking away. None of this is worth anything if you walk away." "Then I guess we both die," Rhett said, and dove sideways as Voss fired. The two men crashed together in the narrow space, fists and elbows flying. Voss was bigger, stronger, but Rhett fought with the desperation of a man who'd already died once and refused to do it again. They slammed into the wall, into a rack of rifles that clattered to the floor, into the table that held the gold. The box tipped, spilling coins across the floor in a golden waterfall. Voss saw it happen, and something broke in his eyes. A final thread of sanity snapping. He drove his knee into Rhett's injured ribs, and Rhett's vision went white with pain. Voss's hands found his throat, squeezing, crushing. Rhett's hands scrabbled across the floor, fingers closing around something cold and hard. The knife from his boot knocked loose in the struggle. He drove it upward with every ounce of strength he had left. The blade punched through Voss's ribs, slid between them, found something vital. Voss's eyes went wide, his grip loosening. He staggered back, looking down at the knife protruding from his chest with an expression of pure disbelief. "You," he started to say. Then he fell, his body hitting the floor with a sound like a sack of grain dropping. Rhett lay there for a moment, gasping, every part of him screaming in agony. Outside, the sounds of battle were fading, replaced by the roar of flames and the cries of the wounded. He forced himself to his feet, scooped as much gold as he could back into the box, and stumbled toward the door. The compound was a vision of hell. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, some moving, most not. The fires had spread to the main building now, and the heat was intense enough to sear his lungs. Through the smoke, he could see figures moving, Crow's men, rounding up the survivors, executing anyone who resisted. Rhett stayed in the shadows, moving along the wall toward the gate. Someone shouted behind him, and he ran, the box clutched against his chest, bullets whining past his ears. He made it through the gate and into the darkness beyond, his legs threatening to give out with every step. Behind him, the compound burned like a funeral pyre, lighting up the night sky for miles. Rhett ran until he couldn't anymore, until his body finally gave out and he collapsed in the scrubland, the box of gold falling beside him. He lay there in the dirt, staring up at the stars, tasting blood and smoke and ash. Somewhere behind him, Tallow Creek's careful balance had shattered. Voss was dead. Crow had what he wanted, and Rhett had survived when every rational part of the universe said he shouldn't have. But he wasn't done yet. Not quite yet. Dawn found Rhett still lying in the scrubland, the box of gold pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He'd passed out sometime during the night, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion and pain, and when consciousness dragged him back to the surface, the sun was already climbing above the eastern horizon. Every inch of him hurt. The wounds in his chest had torn open again, fresh blood soaking through his shirt in dark patches. His ribs screamed with every breath. His jaw throbbed where Voss had hit him, and his hands were raw from the ropes and the fight. But he was alive, and the gold was still with him, and that meant he still had work to do. He forced himself upright, swaying slightly as vertigo washed over him. In the distance, a column of black smoke rose into the morning sky from where the compound had been. The fire must have burned through the night, consuming everything Voss had built. Rhett stared at it for a long moment, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow satisfaction. One down. He picked up the box, lighter now, with maybe half the gold still inside, and started walking south toward Tallow Creek. Each step was agony, but he kept moving, driven by the same stubborn refusal to quit that had kept him breathing in the desert when he should have died. The town appeared as the sun reached its zenith, shimmering in the heat like something from a fever dream. Rhett approached slowly, watching for signs of trouble. The streets were quieter than usual, people moving with the nervous energy of those who knew something terrible had happened but weren't sure what yet. He made his way to the livery stable, where he found the old man mucking out stalls with the same methodical rhythm as always. The man looked up as Rhett entered, his rheumy eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. "Thought you might be dead," the old man said. "Not yet." Rhett set the box down carefully. I need my horse, and I need you to keep this safe for an hour, maybe 2. The old man glanced at the box, then at Rhett's blood-stained clothes, then back at the box. That what all the trouble's been about? Part of it. And if someone comes looking for it, tell them you never saw me. Tell them I died in the fire at Voss's compound. Tell them whatever keeps you breathing. Rhett pulled out his last gold coin and pressed it into the old man's palm. But keep it safe. The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded and tucked the box behind a stack of hay bales where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Where are you heading? To finish what I started. Rhett left the livery and walked toward the center of town, his hand resting on the gun he'd taken from Cole. People stared as he passed, their expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that might have been respect. Word of the compound's destruction had clearly spread, and they knew he'd been involved somehow. The saloon doors swung open as he approached, and Mara stepped out onto the porch. She took one look at him, and her face went pale. "Sweet mercy," she breathed. "You look like you've been through hell." "Close enough." Rhett climbed the steps, his legs threatening to give out. "Is Crow back?" "Got in about an hour ago. Him and his men rode straight to the bank. Haven't come out since." Her eyes searched his face. "Rhett, what happened out there?" "What needed to happen? Voss is dead, his compound is ash, and now Crow thinks he's won. Hasn't he? Not even close." Rhett started to move past her, but she caught his arm. "You can barely stand. Whatever you're planning, you're in no shape to do it. I'll manage." "You'll get yourself killed." "Probably." He met her eyes, and something in his expression made her step back. "But I'm not leaving this town until every man who put me in the ground knows what it costs to dig shallow graves." He pulled free and walked across the street toward the bank, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The door was locked, but that had never stopped a determined man. Rhett drove his boot into it just below the handle, and the wood splintered with a crack like a gunshot. Inside, the bank was dim and cool, the air heavy with the smell of paper and ink. Rhett could hear voices from the back room raised in argument. He moved through the main area, past the polished counters and the safe with its heavy door standing open. The voices became clearer as he approached. "Telling you, the gold wasn't all there. Half of it's missing, maybe more." "Then your men didn't search thoroughly enough. We tore that compound apart. It wasn't there." Rhett pushed open the door to the back room. 4 men looked up, startled. Crow, the marshal, and 2 of Crow's hired guns. The marshal's hand went to his weapon, but froze when he saw who it was. "Rhett Vale," Crow said, his composure slipping for just a moment before the polished mask returned. "I'm surprised to see you alive. Last I saw, you were Voss's prisoner. Last you saw, you'd sold me to him." Rhett stepped into the room, the gun hanging loose in his hand. "Funny how things work out." Crow's eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to Rhett's face. "I did what was necessary to achieve our mutual goal. Voss is dead, his organization destroyed. You should be thanking me." "Should I? For using me as bait? For planning to kill me the moment I'd served my purpose? I saved your life twice. Once at the Dusty Rose. Once when I could have let Voss torture you to death. That should count for something. It counts for you dying last instead of first." The room went very still. The 2 hired guns started to move, but Crow held up a hand, stopping them. "You're making a mistake," Crow said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I own this town now. The marshal works for me. Half the people on the street work for me. You kill me, you won't make it out of this building alive." "Maybe not," Rhett said, "but you'll still be dead." "And what about the boy? Thomas?" Crow's smile was cold. "You think I didn't notice you using him as your errand runner? You think I don't know where he is right now? One word from me and he's a corpse before sunset." Rhett's finger tightened on the trigger, rage flooding through him, hot and vicious. But Crow was right. The bastard was right. One bullet might kill him, but it wouldn't save Thomas. Wouldn't change the fact that Crow had built his web of control so thoroughly that cutting off the head wouldn't kill the spider. "Lower the gun," Crow said quietly, "and we can talk about this like civilized men. There's nothing civilized about you." "Perhaps not. But I'm alive, and I'm rich, and I'm going to continue being both for a very long time. Crow moved to the window, looking out at the street. You want revenge? Fine. I'll give you Cole and Dutch. They're at the doctor's office right now, recovering from the wounds you gave them. Take them, do what you want with them, and then leave Tallow Creek. That's the deal. And the gold? I keep what I recovered from the compound. You keep whatever you managed to take. We both walk away with something. Rhett stared at him, this man who'd built an empire on lies and manipulation, who'd probably killed more people with a pen than Voss had ever killed with a gun. The temptation to shoot him anyway was almost overwhelming, but Thomas was out there somewhere, and as long as Crow drew breath, the boy was in danger. I want something else, Rhett said. Crow turned from the window, interest flickering in his eyes. I'm listening. You let Mara Keene sell her saloon and leave town. No interference, no making her life hell, no having your people burn the place down the moment I'm gone. She gets to walk away clean. And the boy? He comes with me. Crow considered this, his fingers drumming on the windowsill. You're asking for quite a lot. I'm asking for 2 lives that you'll barely notice are gone. Everyone is noticed when they leave. It sets a precedent. Crow walked back to his desk and sat down, steepling his fingers. But I'm willing to be magnanimous. Miss Keene can sell her establishment and depart with my blessing. The boy can go with you, assuming he wants to. And in exchange, you disappear. You take whatever gold you have, you take your revenge on Cole and Dutch, and you ride out of Tallow Creek before tomorrow's sunset. If you ever come back, if you ever speak a word about what happened here, the deal is void, and everyone you care about dies. Understood? Rhett wanted to put a bullet in the man's skull more than he'd ever wanted anything in his life. But he'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you had to swallow poison to stay alive long enough to spit it back out. Understood, he said. Excellent. Crow pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. I'll have the marshal escort you to the doctor's office. What happens there is between you and your former associates. After that, you have until sunset tomorrow. I suggest you use the time wisely. The marshal moved to Rhett's side, his expression carefully neutral. This way, he said. They walked out of the bank and down the street toward the doctor's office, a small building marked by a painted sign showing a mortar and pestle. The marshal didn't speak, and Rhett was grateful for it. Words felt useless right now, cheap and hollow, compared to what was about to happen. The doctor's office smelled of carbolic acid and blood. The doctor himself, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly, looked up as they entered, his eyes widening. Marshal, he said nervously, I wasn't expecting— The 2 men in the back, the marshal interrupted, Cole Hendricks and Dutch Farrow. Mr. Vale here has business with them. The doctor's gaze slid to Rhett, taking in the gun, the blood, the cold fury in his eyes. I can't allow violence in my office. Then look the other way, the marshal said flatly, because it's happening whether you watch or not. The doctor swallowed hard and stepped aside, gesturing toward a door at the back of the room. Rhett pushed through it into a small recovery area with 2 cots separated by a thin curtain. Cole lay on one cot, his leg bandaged and his face pale with pain and blood loss. Dutch occupied the other, his chest wrapped in bandages, his breathing shallow and labored. Both men looked up as Rhett entered, and fear flooded their faces. Jesus, Cole whispered. How are you still alive? Because I'm better at staying that way than you are at killing me. Rhett pulled up a chair and sat down, his gun resting on his knee. We need to talk. About what? Dutch's voice was weak, thready. You already shot us. What more do you want? Answers, starting with why. The 2 men exchanged glances. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice bitter. You really want to know? Because you were the liability. The job was supposed to be simple. Ride in, take the gold, ride out. But you had to make it complicated. Had to talk about splitting it fair, about making sure everyone got their share. The others didn't want fair. They wanted it all. So they decided to cut me out. Decided to cut you down, Dutch corrected. Dead men don't come looking for their share. Who pulled the trigger? Another silence. Then Cole said, Jake Marlowe. He put both bullets in you, said it was nothing personal, just business. Jake Marlowe. Rhett remembered him, a cold-eyed killer who'd done time in Yuma and come out meaner than he'd gone in. Where is he now? Dead, Cole said. Got himself killed in a saloon fight in El Paso about 3 days after we split up. Ironic, really. Survived your revenge, but not his own stupidity. Rhett absorbed this, feeling something twist in his chest. One of the men who'd put bullets in him was already dead, killed by random violence instead of justice. It felt wrong, incomplete. And the others? He asked. Scattered, Dutch said. Last I heard, Sam went to California. Ben headed to Texas. They took their share and ran. So the men who'd betrayed him were gone, disappeared into the vastness of the frontier where they could be anyone, anywhere. Rhett could spend years tracking them down and maybe never find them. The thought filled him with a frustration so intense it was almost physically painful. But he still had Cole and Dutch. They were here, wounded and helpless, and they'd been part of it. You left me to die in the desert, Rhett said quietly. You took what I'd bled for and you sold it to a man like Voss. And you did it without a second thought. We thought you were already dead, Cole protested weakly. The way you went down, the blood. I wasn't dead. I was alive enough to hear you laughing, alive enough to watch you ride away. The room was silent except for Dutch's labored breathing. Rhett stood slowly, raising the gun. Both men flinched, Cole trying to scramble backward on the cot despite his wounded leg, Dutch too weak to move at all. Please, Dutch whispered. We were just following orders. Jake said, Jake's dead. You're not. Rhett cocked the hammer, the click loud in the quiet room. Any last words? Wait, Cole's voice cracked. Wait, please. We can make this right. We can tell you where the others went, help you track them down. You can die knowing that everything you built on my grave collapsed. Rhett's voice was flat, empty of everything except cold finality. That's all you get. He pulled the trigger twice. The gunshots echoed in the small room, impossibly loud. Cole jerked once and went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Dutch didn't move at all, already too far gone to feel the bullet that finished him. Rhett stood there for a moment, looking at the bodies, waiting to feel something, satisfaction, closure, anything. But there was only emptiness, vast and hollow. He turned and walked out, past the doctor who stood frozen in the doorway, past the marshal who nodded once with something that might have been approval, out into the street where the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. 2 down. The rest scattered to the winds. It would have to be enough. He made his way back to the livery where the old man was waiting with the box of gold and the roan already saddled. Heard the shots, the old man said. Figured you'd be leaving soon. Soon as I collect one more thing. Rhett tied the box to the saddle, securing it with careful knots. You seen Thomas? Boy's been hiding in the loft since this morning. Think he's scared. He should be. This whole town should be. Rhett climbed the ladder to the loft and found Thomas curled up in a pile of hay, his eyes red from crying. Are you here to say goodbye? The boy asked. I'm here to ask if you want to come with me. Thomas stared at him, disbelief and hope warring on his young face. Come with you? Where? Anywhere but here. I'm riding out at first light tomorrow, and I'm not coming back. You can stay in Tallow Creek and take your chances, or you can ride with me and we'll figure out the rest as we go. What about Crow? What about... I made a deal. He won't touch you if you leave with me. And if he breaks that deal, I'll come back and burn everything he's built to ash. He knows that. Thomas wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. Why would you take me? You don't owe me nothing. Maybe not. But you're a good kid, and you deserve better than dying young in a town that doesn't give a damn about you. Rhett held out his hand. So what do you say? The boy stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then he reached out and gripped it, his small fingers strong, despite their trembling. I'll come, he said. Good. Pack whatever you can carry and meet me at the saloon in an hour. We've got one more stop to make. Rhett climbed down from the loft and mounted the roan, riding slowly through the town one last time. People watched from windows and doorways, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. He'd come here a ghost looking for revenge, and he'd torn apart the careful balance that had kept Tallow Creek running. Now Crow would rebuild it in his own image, probably worse than it had been before. But at least Voss was dead. At least Cole and Dutch had paid for their betrayal. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was something. He found Mara outside the saloon, sweeping the porch with mechanical efficiency. She looked up as he approached, setting the broom aside. "Heard about Cole and Dutch," she said. "Heard about your deal with Crow, too. Whole town's heard it by now. You selling this place?" "Already got a buyer lined up. Some businessman from Denver who thinks he can turn it into something respectable." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "As if anything in this town could ever be respectable. Where will you go?" "West, I think. Maybe California. Somewhere the sun doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you." She studied his face, her expression softening slightly. "What about you? North, Colorado maybe? Or Wyoming? Somewhere quiet where people don't ask too many questions." "Sounds lonely." "I'm used to lonely." Mara was quiet for a moment, then stepped closer, her voice dropping. "There's something you should know. Crow's already making plans. He told the marshal that once you're gone, he's going to spread word that you were working with Voss all along, that you helped plan the raid on the compound to eliminate competition. He's going to make you the villain in this story." Rhett almost smiled. "Let him. I'll be too far away to care." "You don't care that people will think you're a murderer and a thief?" "People already think that. At least this time half of it's true." She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light against his sleeve. "Thank you for getting me out, for giving me a chance. You did that yourself. I just gave you an excuse." "Still." She stepped back, her expression guarded again. "Be careful out there. The world's full of men like Voss and Crow, and most of them are better at hiding what they are." "I'll keep that in mind." He tipped his hat to her and rode away, heading back toward the livery where Thomas was waiting with a small pack slung over his shoulder. The boy climbed up behind him without a word, wrapping his arms around Rhett's waist. They didn't leave immediately. Instead, Rhett rode to the edge of town and dismounted, walking to a small rise that overlooked the buildings and the desert beyond. From here, he could see almost everything. The saloon where Mara was still sweeping, the bank where Crow was probably counting his new fortune, the marshal's office where justice had died so long ago. Nobody remembered what it looked like. And beyond it all, the desert that had tried to claim him and failed. "You think it'll change?" Thomas asked, standing beside him. "The town, I mean. Think it'll get better now that Voss is gone?" "No," Rhett said quietly. "It'll just get different. Crow will rule it with a smile instead of a gun, but people will still suffer. The names might change, but the game stays the same." "Then why'd you do it? Why risk everything if it wasn't going to make things better?" Rhett was silent for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. "Because some things need to burn before anything new can grow. And because I needed to prove that men like Voss and Crow don't get to bury people and walk away clean." "Did you prove it?" "I don't know, but they'll remember me. Every time Crow looks at what's left of Voss's compound, every time someone mentions the stranger who came back from the dead, they'll remember that some ghosts don't stay quiet." They stood there as the sun sank lower, and Rhett felt something shift inside him. Not peace. He wasn't sure he'd ever find that, but something close to it. A sense that he'd done what he came to do, even if it hadn't turned out exactly as he'd planned. Movement in the town caught his eye. A figure emerging from one of the buildings, walking with purpose toward the edge of town. As it drew closer, Rhett recognized the shape. A woman. Her dark hair loose around her shoulders, carrying a single bag. Mara. She stopped when she saw them on the rise, raising one hand in a brief wave. Then she turned south and started walking, her silhouette growing smaller with each step until the desert swallowed her whole. "She's leaving on foot?" Thomas asked, incredulous. "She'll catch a stage at the next town over, probably already paid for passage." Rhett watched until she disappeared completely. "She's tougher than she looks." They mounted the horse again and rode north as the last light faded from the sky. Behind them, Tallow Creek settled into its evening rhythm, unaware or uncaring that the man who'd torn it apart was leaving just as quietly as he'd arrived. The desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, dark and vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there, the men who'd betrayed Rhett were still alive, still breathing, still spending the money they'd stolen. Jake Marlowe was dead, but the others had escaped justice, scattered to the winds where he'd never find them. Part of him wanted to hunt them down, to spend years tracking them across the frontier until he'd killed every last one. But as the miles fell away behind them and the night deepened around them, that desire faded to something smaller, more manageable. He'd gotten what mattered most. He'd proven he couldn't be killed by betrayal or bullets or the desert itself. He'd torn down one man's empire and put fear into another's heart. And he'd saved two people who deserved better than Tallow Creek could offer. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all the justice the frontier allowed. They rode through the night, stopping only when exhaustion forced them to rest. Thomas fell asleep almost immediately, curled up in a bedroll by the small fire Rhett built. Rhett sat watch, his gun across his knees, staring into the flames and thinking about everything that had happened. The gold sat in its box beside him, still only half full. Enough to start over somewhere, to buy land or a business, or just time to figure out what came next. He'd bled for it, killed for it, nearly died for it more than once. But as he sat there in the darkness with the fire crackling and the boy sleeping peacefully nearby, Rhett realized the gold had never really been the point. The point was that he'd refused to stay dead. Refused to let the men who'd wronged him walk away clean. Refused to let a town built on fear and cruelty continue unchallenged. He'd come back from the grave not to reclaim treasure, but to prove that some things couldn't be buried. When morning came, they broke camp and continued north. The landscape changed gradually, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills, the scrub brush becoming taller, patches of green appearing where water collected. By afternoon of the second day, they could see mountains in the distance, their peaks white with snow that never melted. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked. "Don't know yet," Rhett admitted, "but we'll know it when we see it." They found it 3 days later, a small valley tucked between hills, with a creek running through it and enough flat land for a cabin and a few head of cattle. There was no town nearby, no neighbors visible in any direction, just empty country waiting for someone willing to work it. Rhett dismounted and stood looking at the valley for a long time. Behind him, Thomas slid down from the horse and came to stand beside him. "This it?" the boy asked. "Could be." Rhett glanced down at him. "What do you think?" Thomas surveyed the valley with the serious expression of someone much older. "Think it's far enough away from people that nobody will come asking questions." "That's what I thought, too." They made camp that night by the creek, and in the morning Rhett opened the box of gold for the first time since leaving Tallow Creek. The coins gleamed in the sunlight, still carrying the promise that had driven men to kill for them. But looking at them now, Rhett felt only weariness. He counted out a portion, enough to buy supplies, tools, livestock, everything they'd need to build a life here. The rest he divided into 2 roughly equal shares. One he buried near a distinctive rock formation, marking it carefully in his mind. The other he loaded back into the box. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, watching. "Making sure we have options. Some of this stays buried in case we need it. Some we use now, and some—" He paused, thinking. "Some goes to the people who helped us. The liveryman in Tallow Creek, the woman who runs the boarding house, maybe even the doctor, though he doesn't deserve it. Why give it to them? Because they could have turned me into Voss or Crow and didn't. That's worth something." Over the next few weeks, Rhett made 2 trips. One to the nearest town to buy supplies and arrange for materials to be delivered, and one back south to Tallow Creek. He didn't go into the town itself, just left packages at the edge of it with names written on them, then rode away before anyone could see him. By the time winter began to threaten, they'd built a small cabin with a good fireplace and a roof that didn't leak. They'd bought 3 cows and a dozen chickens, and Thomas had proven surprisingly adept at coaxing a garden out of the rocky soil. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and paid for with gold that had cost too much blood. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about them? The men who betrayed you, the ones who got away?" Rhett stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Sometimes. Usually late at night when I can't sleep. I think about tracking them down, making them pay the way Cole and Dutch paid. But then morning comes and I look at what we're building here, and it seems less important. Because you already got your revenge? Because I already proved what I needed to prove, that they didn't kill me, that I'm more than what they tried to make me." He glanced at the boy. "Some battles you win by surviving them, not by destroying your enemies." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. What about Crow? You think he's still in Tallow Creek? Probably. Building his empire, exploiting whoever's foolish enough to trust him. Men like that don't change. Doesn't that bother you? Knowing he's out there. It bothers me, Red admitted, but not enough to go back. I made my peace with Tallow Creek. Whatever happens there now isn't my concern. The winter came hard that year, with snow that piled up to the windows and temperatures that dropped so low the creek froze solid. But the cabin held, and they had enough supplies to last. And when spring finally arrived, they'd survived their first season in the valley. As the snow melted and the world turned green again, Rhett found himself thinking less about revenge and more about the future, about teaching Thomas to ride better, to shoot straight, to read the weather and the land, about building something that would outlast them both. One warm afternoon in late spring, they were repairing the corral when Rhett noticed a rider approaching from the south. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, but the rider came slowly, hands visible, showing no threat. As the figure drew closer, Rhett's breath caught. It was a woman with dark hair and green eyes, riding a good horse and wearing traveling clothes that had seen hard use. She stopped a few yards away and dismounted, her expression carefully neutral. "Mara," Rhett said. "Rhett." She looked at the cabin, the corral, the garden that Thomas had expanded. "You've done well here. What are you doing in this part of the country?" "California didn't suit me. Too crowded, too many people asking questions." She gestured to the valley. "Heard about a man and a boy building something in the middle of nowhere. Thought it sounded familiar. How'd you find us?" "Asked around, followed rumors, got lucky." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I won't stay if you don't want me to, but I thought maybe you could use someone who knows how to keep a house, tend stock, survive in places that don't welcome strangers." Thomas had stopped working and was watching the exchange with open curiosity. Rhett glanced at him, then back at Mara. "It's hard work," he said, "and lonely. No neighbors, no town nearby, nothing but land and sky, and whatever you can build with your own hands." "I've had enough of towns," Mara replied, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Rhett studied her for a long moment, reading the hope and wariness in equal measure on her face. She'd left everything behind just like he had, walked away from the only life she'd known because staying meant slow death by 1,000 compromises. "There's an extra room in the cabin," he said finally. "We can add on more if we need to, and we could use another hand, especially come harvest time." The tension went out of Mara's shoulders. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've spent a winter here. Then decide if you still want to stay." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Deal." That night they sat around the fire together, Rhett, Thomas, and Mara, and for the first time since the desert had tried to bury him, Rhett felt something that might have been contentment. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it somewhere down the road. The gold was buried, the debts were settled, and the ghosts that had driven him across the frontier were finally quiet. Voss was dead. Cole and Dutch were dead. Crow was alive but far away, building his empire on sand that would eventually swallow him whole. And Rhett was here, in a valley with no name, building something real, with people who'd chosen to stand beside him not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He thought about the man he'd been before the betrayal, confident, trusting, believing that loyalty meant something. That man was dead, buried in the desert alongside the illusions that had kept him naive. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the man sitting here now, scarred and wary and unwilling to ever be caught off guard again, was the man he'd needed to become. As the fire burned down to embers and the stars wheeled overhead, Rhett made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't forget what Tallow Creek had taught him about the darkness that lived in men's hearts, but he wouldn't let it define him either. He'd survived too much, fought too hard, to become just another bitter man consumed by the past. Instead, he'd build. He'd teach Thomas everything he knew. He'd work alongside Mara to turn this valley into something that could sustain them. And if the ghosts came calling again, if the past reached out to drag him back into the darkness, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else, with his eyes open, his gun loaded, and the absolute refusal to stay buried. The frontier was vast and unforgiving, full of men like Voss who took what they wanted, and men like Crow who built empires on broken promises. But it also had space for people willing to carve out their own piece of it, to build something that belonged to no one but themselves. Rhett Vale had come back from the dead to settle accounts, and he'd done that. The gold was his, the revenge was taken, and the men who'd betrayed him knew, or would have known if they were still breathing, that some ghost didn't forgive. But more importantly, he'd proven that survival itself was a kind of victory, that refusing to quit when the world said you were finished was its own form of justice. As sleep finally claimed him that night, Rhett's last thought was simple and profound. He'd lived. Despite everything, despite the bullets and the betrayal and the desert that should have claimed him, he'd lived. And in a world as brutal and unforgiving as the frontier, that was victory enough. The sun would rise again tomorrow, casting its light across the valley that was now home. There would be work to do, fences to mend, crops to tend, a life to build from the ashes of the old one. But tonight, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with him, Rhett Vale finally allowed himself to rest. The ghosts were quiet. The debts were paid. And the man who'd refused to stay buried could finally, after everything, lay down his weapons and breathe.